Okay, well, we finished the Dutch Twins. I said I was going to start with a new book, and I'm going to start with the Pioneer Twins, which, if I remember correctly, was one of my favorites growing up. It's by Lucy Fitch Perkins, my great grandmother, as the previous one was. It's also illustrated by her. So all these illustrations, like the previous book, are illustrated by Lucy Fitch Perkins. I hope everyone's able to enjoy this during our isolation, but I figured the Pioneer Twins, since I'm in Utah, was a little more appropriate because it's about, going west and those adventures. So we have the Pioneer Twins by Lucy Fitch Perkins, and looks like they're well dressed for that. I'm going to read the foreword as well, because, and this book was written in 1927 as opposed to the previous, which was written in 1911. So this is one of a later book. So the foreword, in an elm-shaded street in a nearby town, there stands a pleasant house. In the house there is a library, and in that library, hidden away in a safe place, there is a little worn book covered with faded brown leather. It is the pocket diary of a brave man who crossed the Great Plains with an ox team in the early days of the California gold rush. Its pages are yellow with age. The ink is pale, and the writing is so fine that one almost needs a magnifying glass to read it. Here, in as few words as possible, are recorded some of the episodes and adventures of this terrible journey. There's also a list of the provisions and equipment that he took with him, and accounts showing what he paid for having his oxen shod and for being ferried over rivers in steamboats or in Indian canoes. In one short paragraph, he tells of an Indian massacre, in another of the drowning of members of his company when fording a river, and in still another he inscribes the names of those who died of hardship and exposure on the trail. This precious record was placed in my hands by the grandson of the man who wrote it, and its pages suggested much of the material woven into the story of pioneer days. The route followed by the twins is the same that is traced so carefully in this diary, and many of the incidents and events of their journey are authenticated by some note or statement in the record. Such adventures were common experience of the army of men, women, and children that crossed the great American desert in the days less than 80 years ago, when there were few steamboats and fewer steam trains in the whole world, and when travel as we know it now was not yet even prophesied. These sturdy pioneers made a pathway across the continent for all future generations to follow, and over the route that cost them 6 months of suffering and danger, we now pass in 3 days of luxurious idleness. More precious than the wonderful development of our country they made possible is the heritage of courage and fortitude they left to those whose duty and privilege it is to carry on their constructive spirit in our own day, and to triumph as they did in works of peace. So, and if you think about it today, this was 1927 when that was written. We can cross it in 4 or 5 hours, or faster, depending on the plane. So we're going to start with The Log House on the Prairie. And here we have, I'm assuming, some of the characters. It's been a long time since I read this story. School was over for the day, and a crowd of eager, laughing boys and girls poured out of the little red schoolhouse standing beside a muddy Illinois road and scattered in different directions toward their homes. 2 children, a brother and a sister, came last out of the door and hurried forward to join a little freckled-faced, tow-headed lad of about their own age, who had already reached the corner. "Wait for us, Billy, we're coming," called the girl. "Can't," answered the freckled one, briefly. "Gotta go to the store for Ma." "You come along with me?" "Can't," returned the girl. "Aunt Maria told us we had to come straight home from school, and she's awfully set." "Goodbye, then," said Billy, and he trotted off whistling. Left to themselves, the boy and the girl turned in the opposite direction and trudged slowly along in silence until they came within sight of the log farmhouse standing in the open field at some distance from the road, which was their home. Here their steps lagged. The boy stopped now and again to break with the heel of his stout boots the thin crust of ice forming over the puddles in the road, and his sister stood still from time to time to stare toward the house as if looking for something that she missed. From its red chimney, a thin thread of smoke curled toward the sky. The girl pointed to it. "Look there, Jim," she said. "The smoke's rising. Maybe it'll be clear tomorrow. There's a yellow streak in the sky, too." "Yep," said the boy, lifting his eyes to follow her pointing finger. "Maybe so." He turned to the puddles and had brought his heel down upon another thin sheet of ice with a satisfying crash. When his sister again called to him, "And look there by the gate, Jimmy," she said, "there's a horse and wagon. Sure as you live, Aunt Maria's got company." "She can have her company to herself for all of me," growled the boy, kicking a frozen clod of mud across the road into the ditch. "I shan't go in." "Nor shall I," said the girl. Then she burst out passionately. "I never want to go in any more now that Father and Mother aren't there, and Aunt Maria is." She tried to check a rising sob and wiped her eyes energetically with her rough mitten. The boy looked at her in helpless distress. "Oh, come now, Josie," he begged. "Don't you cry, or you'll start me bawling too. Don't you mind how Father used to say, it'll be all the same 100 years from now?" "What good is 100 years from now to us?" sobbed the girl. "We're here now. I can't get used to her not being at the window when we come home from school." "It isn't a mite of use to cry about it anyway," said the boy. "Crying won't bring Father back from California or Mother back from heaven, either one." "Maybe Mother wouldn't want to come back if she could," said the girl. "Heaven must be a lot nicer than this place from what the preacher said at the funeral. Wings and golden streets and everything. I just wish I had wings. I know what I'd do with them." The boy made no reply, and after a moment's pause, the girl's grief burst forth afresh. "If only we could get rid of Aunt Maria. It wouldn't be so hard," she said bitterly. "If it could only be you, me, and Ben and Ginger." The boy jammed his fists deeper into his pockets, hunched his shoulders, and cast a black look at the house before he exploded into speech. "Aunt Maria," he snorted. "I like her just about worse than the measles and the mumps both together. She's a regular..." He got so far in an effort to express the degree of his dislike, but inspiration failed him. "Well, anyway, I don't like her," he finished weakly. "She never lets you do what you want to do, and she all the time pesters you to do the things you'd rather be licked than have to do any time." "I don't like her any better than you do," agreed the girl, "even if she is Mother's sister." "She's only just a half-sister anyway," urged Jimmy, "and it's the wrong half." They had now reached the cart path that led from the road back to the farm buildings. "I tell you what, sis," said the boy, "let's turn in here and go into the barn, so Aunt Maria can't see us from the window. Maybe Ben's home, and if he is, he'll be out there too. He likes her just about worse than we do." Suddenly he stooped and clapped his hands together. "Come on, Ginger, old boy," he called, and a large yellow dog came bounding out of the open door of the barn and rushed toward them, barking a glad welcome. He jumped up and planted his muddy paws on her shoulders and tried to lick their faces, then ran around and round in frantic circles to express his joy. "Good old Ginger," hissed. "Now," said the boy, lifting his finger warmly. "Where's Ben?" Instantly the dog stood still and whined a little questioning whine. "Go find Ben," said the boy again, and off went the dog like a shot. He dashed in among a few hens that were scratching about in the hay, strewn over the barn floor, and sent them squawking out the door. He leaped up and put his paws on the front of the stall, where the cow was placidly chewing her cud, and made her jump. He ran to the corn bin, stirring up the pig on the way, and when the children reached the door, he was there to greet them, and say almost as plainly as words could do, "No brother Ben here. I've looked everywhere." "Ben isn't here," said the boy. "No use looking for him. Ginger knows. Come on, sis. Let's slip into the pig trot. Into the dog trot, sorry. There's a chink in the logs and we can peek in and see who's with Aunt Maria. Maybe I can scare up a piece of corn pone or something if she's not looking. I'm as hungry as a weasel after the chickens, and sometimes she sets things away in the big room." "I'm hungry too," agreed the girl, and the children at once ran out the door, crept around behind the barn, and started cautiously toward the house. Ginger followed them with his tail wagging so hard that the whole back room, half of him wagged too. The 2 rooms in the log farmhouse were connected by an open passageway called the dog trot. There were no windows in the walls of the passage, but on one side a door opened into the kitchen where the family really lived. On the other side, another door led into a large bare room where all sorts of things were stored, and where Aunt Maria, in her less cautious moments, sometimes set food away. The children tiptoed quietly into this runway, and standing side by side, peeped through a crack where the clay, which was used to fill the chinks between the logs, had fallen out. Though the slit was narrow, it was long enough to give them both a good view of the kitchen. Fortunately, Aunt Maria's back was turned at the moment, for she was bending over the fireplace to lift the teapot from the hearth, where it had been set to keep hot. On the farther side of the fireplace sat her visitor. The children recognized the placid face of Mrs. Sanders, Billy's mother, and their own best friend, who lived on a farm half a mile across the fields. The leaping flames of the log fire lit the room. With a comfortable glow, and showed 2 fat beds covered with gay patchwork quilts. In the dim corners and underneath one of them, a trundle bed where the children could still remember having slept. It danced over the few plates on the dresser and sparkled in the cups on the table, which stood between Aunt Maria and her guest. "Have another cup, do, Mrs. Sanders," Aunt Maria was saying. "It'll chirk you up for whatever's before you. That's what I say to Reynolds." Aunt Maria always referred to her husband as Reynolds. "And goodness knows I need something stiffening before these young ones get home from school every day." She filled her visitor's cup and her own sighed heavily, and sitting down in her chair gave herself up the enjoyment of tea and her troubles. "I never was one to talk," she went on, as I observed to Reynolds. "It's always my way to suffer in silence, but I must say those young ones surely do need chastening. The big boy isn't so cantankerous, but the twins," she shook her head solemnly, They're always up to something. And if you ask me," Mrs. Sanders hadn't asked her, but Aunt Maria obliged just the same, "if you asked me which one is worse than the other, I'd nominate the girl. She might just as well be a boy and done with it. But laws, Mrs. Sanders, what can you expect? Their mother all the time humored them and gave them their own way. She spared the rod and spoiled the child, just the same as Scripture says. She hadn't the spirit of a rabbit herself, for when her husband got the gold fever and lit out for the diggings, she just peeked and pined until she up and died." This could have been no news to Mrs. Sanders, for she had been their kindest neighbor during the hard days that had passed before their mother's death. The children had not meant to eavesdrop, but now they forgot everything, even their hunger, their eagerness to hear Mrs. Saunders replied. They listened in vain. Mrs. Saunders' eyes snapped, but she sipped her tea and said nothing. Aunt Maria seemed not to notice her silence. "Well, the Lord's will be done," she went on piously. "And as I said to Reynolds, this affliction may work to their good. For you mark my words, they're going to learn a thing or two if I'm spared to them." It was as well for Aunt Maria's peace of mind that she did not see 2 pairs of blue eyes at that moment glaring at her through the crack. "She won't teach me anything, I bet. I'm done, I am," whispered Jimmy. Joe stepped up on his toes and frowned. "Keep still," she breathed, for Aunt Maria evidently had more on her mind and was bent on getting it off. "I calculate the older boy can hire out as a farmhand, but it's my cross to have the young one saddled on to me," she complained. Mrs. Sanders stirred uneasily and opened her mouth as if to speak, but Aunt Maria firmly held the floor and continued to suffer with her accustomed silence. "It's no more than right that they should bring along with them whatever's left here. It's little enough at best, but 'twill help them some toward their keep. There's a good cow and a parcel of chickens, besides the oxen and horses and the pig. It's better than nothing." "I should say it was," murmured Mrs. Sanders, and then shut her lip tight as if she were holding in a whole swarm of angry words. Aunt Maria set down her cup. "I calculate they can be made to do quite a bit of work, too. They have a firm hand over them," she said complacently, "but their mother brought them up to think that they were born to be waited on. They'll get their eyes open before I'm through with them." Here Jimmy ran out his tongue and nearly bit it off by accident when he snapped his mouth shut again. Mrs. Sanders now managed to get in a word. Seems kind of harsh to separate them from Ben, she said. He's all they've got left unless their pa comes home, and that's not likely for quite a spell yet. Ben's a good brother, and he has a level head on him, if he's only 17. The more reason why he's got to shift for himself, declared Aunt Maria grimly. And if the children don't like it, they'll just have to lump it. Beggars can't be choosers. But they're not beggars, protested Mrs. Sanders, looking ready to burst. Likely as not, their pa will turn up a heap of gold out there in California. Why, my man says that out there she got no further. Humph, said Aunt Maria. He hasn't sent any money home yet. They haven't heard from him but once since he got to those God-forsaken parts. I reckon it isn't so easy sending money back, urged Mrs. Sanders. Nor yet letters. The man hasn't been prospecting long. Took 5 months to get there. He's been gone less than a year, all told. Give him time. He was always a faithful provider, but I reckon he can't work miracles any more than some of us. Aunt Maria ignored the thrust. He was always taking a new notion, she returned. Roving, that's what he is. I shouldn't be surprised if he never came back. There's plenty that don't. There might be more than one way of accounting for it if he ever did, argued Mrs. Sanders. They say it's a mighty rough life out there, and men are no more fit to look after themselves than so many children anyway. You know that. All the more reason those young ones shouldn't be building up false hopes then, declared Aunt Maria sternly. They'll rear around some when the split with Ben comes, and there'll be terrible goings-on when it comes to parting with that good-for-nothing dog. But it isn't nature for them to keep on, mourning forever. They've got to take things the way they find them in this world, such as the rest of us, and get used to it. She rose stiffly from her seat. They ought to be home by now, she said, glancing toward the window. Most likely they've been kept after school for not getting their lessons. Mrs. Sanders rose too. I must be going home to start supper. It'll soon be dark as a pocket, and Billy will be coming home hungry as a wolf, she said. And the two women moved toward the door, terrified lest they be caught. The children leapt down the steps to the ground and fled like frightened rabbits to the barn. Once safely within its shelter, they flung themselves down on a heap of hay in an empty stall and cried. Ginger, hearing these sounds of woe, came bounding toward them with their little sympathetic whines, and lying down beside them tried to lick away their tears. The boy put his arms around the dog's neck. She shan't take you away, Ginger. I won't let her, he cried, and Ginger, lifting his nose to express his feelings in a long, drawn-out howl. They were a little comforted by the dog's sympathy, and the sobs gradually died away. For a time there was nothing to ruffle the silence of the barn, but the quiet breathing of the cattle, and the soft whispering noises in the hayloft, and the creaking of floorboards with sounds like stealthy footsteps. Suddenly Ginger gave a short bark and scrambled to his feet, ran to the open door. He hears something. Maybe it's Ben, whispered Joe. Both children sat up in the hay and listened, and soon they too heard the thud of horses' hoofs pounding along the muddy road. It is Ben. Ginger always knows, cried Jim. And jumping up, both children followed the dog. In a moment more, Ben himself came riding through the open door. Hello, he said when he saw Jim and Joe. What are you doing here? Not waiting for an answer, he swung himself off of the horse's neck and stooped to unbuckle the saddle girths. In doing so, he got a nearer view in the dim light of two woe-begone faces. What in the chickens is the matter? He asked, pausing in the act of hanging the saddle on the wooden peg near the door. Your faces are as long as the month of Sundays. Oh, Ben, burst out Joe. It's something awful. Aunt Maria told Mrs. Sanders she's going to separate us. She's going to take the horses and the oxen and the cow and the pigs and the chickens and Jim and me. She said you've got to hire out as farmhand, and she won't let us have Ginger either, added Jim. For an instant, Ben stood still. His jaw dropped, then he shut his mouth with a snap, hung up the saddle, and took off here's the picture. Horse's bridle. Gave her a gentle slap on the flank to send her to her stall, and put on her halter. When this was all done, he said, Well, it'll be everlasting jiggered. How did you find it out? Did Mrs. Sanders tell you? No, we peeked through a chink in the wall and heard her say it. She hasn't seen us. She doesn't know we're home from school. Hum, said Ben. Listeners never hear any good of themselves. He thrust his hands deep down in his pockets and stood still thinking. Now you listen to me, Bub and Sis, he said at last. Don't you let on that you know anything about this, and don't go moping around like chickens with the pip either. She isn't going to do any such thing. Now start your boots, both of you, and throw down some hay for the cattle, while I go to the house for a lantern. I'll tell her we're out doing the chores, and that we'll all be late for supper. That'll make her mad, but she'll have time to get over some of it before we go in." "But Ben," cried Joe, she said. "I don't care a hang what she said," was Ben's answer as he started for the house. "Get to work, both of you. I'll race you, and if you're spry, I'll show you something nice when I get the milking done." Fired by his promise, the children rushed to their tasks. Jim stumbled up the ladder to the loft in the dark and filled the mangers with hay, while Joe bedded the stalls with straw in record time. And when Ben rose from the milking stool, they were both at his elbow, on tiptoe with impatience. "Hurry, Ben, hurry," begged Joe. "I just can't wait another minute." Ben was already rummaging in his pockets, and now he brought out a folded paper with a postmark on it and held it up for them to see. "Look at that," he said. "I stopped at the post office when I came back from the blacksmith. It's from Father." He gave the lantern to Jim, unfolded the precious paper, and began to read. "Bouncing Bet Diggings on the American River near Sutter's Mill, California, October 1st, 1849. Dear wife and children." So far, he read, and interrupted himself to say, "Of course Father doesn't know about Mother yet, and won't for a long time. This was written 5 months ago and only just got here. California seems almost farther off than heaven," murmured Joe, and Ben said, "Like as not it is. I shouldn't wonder." And Jim said, "Oh, go on. What does he say?" "Dear wife and children," Ben began again, "these few lines leave me quite well, and I hope they find you the same. I am now prospecting near Sutter's Mill, where the first gold was found, but I haven't struck pay dirt yet. I have a chance to send this letter by a man who has made his pile and is going back to the States to get his folks and bring them out here. I don't know when I can come back for you, if ever, but someday when Ben gets a little older, maybe he can fill my place, and you'll all come out to join me here. Only I want to send you money so you can come down the Mississippi and around to San Francisco by boat. It's a great and wonderful country out here, but it's terrible chore to get to it. It's a long trip and full of all kinds of dangers, and more people are taking it every day. It's a wonder where all the men come from. Seems like all the men in creation are just pouring in here for all the world, like flies around a keg of molasses. Women are mighty scarce, though, and children more so. It makes a man sense the blessings he just took for granted. I tell you, Mother, I dream at nights sometimes of your apple pies and fried cakes. Other things, too. I can't say I'm partial to my own cooking, but I get enough to eat and have no cause to complain. My tools cost a right smart, and the dust hasn't been panning out as I hoped, so I can't send any money back yet, but I'm hoping to strike it rich almost any day now. And I reckon Peters will agree to take the farm again on shares, same as this year, and that will give you a living until I make my lucky strike, and can send for you, and here's hoping it will be soon. Your loving father and husband, Hiram Miller. That's all, Ben, said Ben, and don't any of you let on to Aunt Maria that we got a letter. You bet your boots we won't, said Jim with conviction. She said Father had a roving disposition, and like as not would never come back at all. She did she? Well, maybe he won't, but Aunt Maria's got a few surprises coming to her of one kind and another, or I'll miss my reckoning. Children, called a strident voice, and from the outer darkness came the sound of footsteps. For the land's sake, where are you keeping yourself? Supper's been ready this half hour. Hush, she's coming, whispered Joe, or gasped Joe, leaping to her feet and nearly falling over, Ginger in the dark. Ben thrust the letter into his pocket. Coming, Aunt Maria, he called, and seizing the milk pail, he led the way to the door. Jim came after him, bearing the lantern, which threw strange, weird shadows of their 3 pairs of legs over the wide landscape as they followed Aunt Maria into the house. The evening meal was eaten by the light of a single candle, while Aunt Maria moved about the kitchen in grim silence. She had already eaten her supper and was busy packing the few clothes she had brought with her when she had come a fortnight before to attend her sister's funeral, and to do what she thought to be her duty by her nephews and niece. In her talk with Mrs. Sanders, she had fully persuaded herself that she was an injured and aggrieved woman, and now she watched the children resentfully as they ate their supper, angry because they were late, and angrier still because They seemed cheerful and paid no heed to her reproachful silence. At last she could keep still no longer. Standing in front of the table with her hands on her hips, she freed her mind. I suppose you young ones will be glad to know I'm going home in the morning, she said bitterly. The news was received without a word, but Joe gave Jim a joyful kick under the table, and Jim choked over his potatoes and upset the salt as a consequence. It had to be thumped in the back by Ben. Aunt Maria stood still until quiet was again restored, and she went back on with her remarks. I'm leaving some things cooked up for you, and if you aren't too lazy to feed yourselves, you can get along easy enough while they last. But after that, you'll have to buckle to and do something for yourselves or go hungry. When I'm gone, you can't play all the way home from school. Find a good supper ready for you when you get there. Here Jim kicked Joe. I'll teach you a few things to get along by yourselves till the term ends. Then I'm coming back to settle things up here. Ben, tomorrow's a Saturday, and you can drive me over to the Four Corners, and I'll take the stage back to Quincy, and your Uncle Reynolds will meet me there. I can't neglect my own work any longer to wait on you. This too brought no answer. The children sat bent over their plates and fed themselves diligently. What time do you want to go? Ben asked at last. The sooner the better, snapped Aunt Maria. Staying is no treat to me, I can tell you. I'll have the horse ready any time you say, answered Ben. 7 o'clock in the morning, then, said she, thumping her carpet bag down beside the door. And now, Josephine and James, you can just get up and wash the dishes by yourselves. The children obeyed without a word, and while the work in the house was being done, Ben went out to shut Ginger in the barn and make sure that the cattle were all right for the night. He was gone for some time. When he returned, he found Aunt Maria snoring under the patchwork quilts of one bed, with Joe wide awake beside her, while in the other corner Jim was mildly sound asleep. When she heard him come in, Joe rose up cautiously on one elbow, and looking down on Aunt Maria's nose, made a motion as if she were going to give it a tweak to stop the fearful sounds that were issuing from it. Ben chuckled in spite of himself. He shook his fist at her warningly, then tiptoed to the fireplace, covered the coals with ashes to keep them alive till morning, and blew out the candle. A moment later, he crawled in beside Jim under the patchwork quilt at the other end of the room, and soon every one in the little log house was asleep. So that ends chapter 1 of The Pioneer Twins by Lucy Fitch Perkins. Tomorrow we will continue with chapter 2, A Secret. I hope everyone get to enjoy this while we're enjoying our isolation. But I figured another family story would be fun, and see what mischief and adventures these twins get up to. Until tomorrow.